Oh my God, what is that? Oh, that makes me want to spew. Maybe that's why they called it the SPIW program. Let's talk about the insane guns that came out of the SPIW program. Hi everybody, welcome back to Classic Firearms. My name's Matt, and today we're going to take another look back at the wonderful and weird world of firearm development because, you know, it is amazing some of the steps that we've gone to, the dead ends, the faults, branches in firearm design that have gotten us to where we are today, and there's a lot of really interesting things to learn in history of firearm design. So, what we're talking about today is the SPIW project, or SPIW, Special Purpose Individual Weapons System, and you know, how this came about in the 1960s, you know, what kind of firearms were developed and where it ended up. So, you know, all the way back at the end of World War II, we did some studies that showed that the accuracy of a firearm wasn't really the limiting factor when it comes to your ability to engage an opponent, due to the fact that, you know, most injuries happen at a much shorter range than had previously been thought. It's not about individual accuracy of the person or the platform so much as volume of fire. You know, a 1 MOA rifle is going to hit a target at 200 yards with the same probability as a 4 MOA rifle. So Project Salvo happened in 1951 in an attempt to try to investigate ways to get more firepower down range from each shooter. They investigated a couple different methods, duplex, triplex rounds, also flechettes, which are little steel darts. Their recommendation was to go with a duplex round, something that had 2 projectiles stacked in one case, but the SPIW program actually focused on the flechette angle. So there were 4 companies that were invited to participate in the trials. That was Harrington and Richardson, Winchester, AAI, and Springfield Armory. And Springfield Armory, of course, at this time was the government armory. It was not a private organization. Of those, they submitted 4 prototypes for initial testing. There was a second round of tests in 1966, and only 2 of those participants actually participated, Springfield Armory and AAI. So let's look at some of the submissions that they had for these tests and see, you know, kind of the interesting designs that came up. So first off, Harrington and Richardson, I love this one because it is the weirdest probably of all the designs that were submitted as part of the SPIW program. Harrington and Richardson, their design was so bad that the Army did not even test it. When they examined the prototype, they said that this would be unsafe to fire and didn't even want to have anything to do with it. So we're off to a great start already. Now, H&R created a multi-bore rifle that would shoot a kind of triple round. So it's a 3 flechettes all loaded into 1 round of ammunition. And these rounds were actually triangular in kind of cross-section. It used a very weird open chamber revolving cylinder to load belted ammunition of these triple rounds into a position in line with the bore, and then would fire all 3 rounds down those 3 bores simultaneously. Obviously, there's plenty of things that can go wrong here. So first off, so imagine you have a rotating cylinder like a revolver, and then each chamber is a third of the way around the cylinder. But it's not completely closed off from the outside because as the belt of ammunition gets fed in, it gets picked up by one of these open chambers, brought around to the top where it's in line with the bore, fired, rotates to the other side where it will then fall out, still belted. And so you end up with kind of, you know, something that runs through your rifle like this, sideways, you know? And therefore, the case has to do a lot more work when it comes to actually withholding all of the forces of the gunpowder going off because there's not a solid chamber around it. Also, you're firing all 3 rounds at one time. So for instance, one of the requirements for the SPIW testing was that it had to carry 60 rounds of direct point ammunition. In other words, you know, bullets, or in this case, flechettes. But because they're shooting 3 flechettes with each round being fired, their magazine only held 20 rounds of ammunition because they said, well, there's 3 for each round. There was problems with the belts. If you didn't make the belts to a correct, thickness, then it could jam as it's trying to move through the action from side to side. There was problems with the ammunition itself because, it's a plastic cased triangular round, and you have all of the forces of the explosion enacted on the case without a completely surrounding chamber. And then even as they were fired, one of the flechettes may make it out of the muzzle before the other ones, and the pressure being released at the end of the muzzle would actually interact with the other bores, causing them to either slow down or even stop, because you have this high pressure being released at the end, which can actually flow into the other bores. So you would end up with creating obstructions or throwing off the flight path of your second and third flechettes, possibly causing problems. It's almost just completely a nightmare. It also was way overweight. It was like 24 pounds. It's this giant monstrosity. So yeah, the H&R prototype didn't even get tested. It is, however, by far the weirdest and most interesting from a mad scientist standpoint of how to design a firearm. So real quick, I do want to talk about a couple of the requirements of the SPIW program. So we mentioned it had to have 60 rounds, have a burst, full auto, and semi-automatic action. It had to be able to mount a 3-round grenade launcher, as well as a bipod and a bayonet. It's almost like the Army just wanted everything, in one package. And keep in mind that, again, one of the main benefits of shooting flechette ammunition is that the rounds are lightweight. They're going very fast. Therefore, it's not really generating a lot of recoil. You can create a very lightweight rifle. And so when you then have to stack a 3-round grenade launcher on the front of it, it's drastically throwing off the weight distribution of the rifle. So you have this rifle that's pretty lightweight, and then you have to throw a 3-round grenade launcher on the front of it, just drastically throwing off any sense of balance to the rifle. And again, we're going for low recoil, very fast cyclic rate rifles. It just didn't make any sense. So the next manufacturer we're going to look at is another one that did not make it to round 2 of the testing, which is Winchester. So the next manufacturer we're talking about is Winchester. Now, Winchester again did not make it into the second round of trials, and there was one element of their submission that did kind of influence the second round. We'll get to that in a second. So they use a very interesting hybrid open and closed bolt system. So what I mean by that is when you were firing this rifle in semi-automatic, it would be a closed bolt system. The bolt would be closed, you pull the trigger, fire. But when you were firing in burst or full auto, it was actually an open bolt gun. So in this case, the bolt would be locked back. When you pull the trigger, it would send the bolt forward, picking up around, and immediately fire it. So that's very interesting. You don't see too many guns that are both, depending on how you're shooting it. It's usually either one way or the other. This also shot from a 60-round drum, so it's fulfilling that requirement of having 60 rounds of point ammunition. It had a short stroke kind of gas system, more like a gas tappet if you want to differentiate between short stroke piston and gas tappet. And during the action of this rifle cycling, you would actually see the barrel reciprocate some as part of a soft recoiling system. Now, it's very kind of interesting because, I just said it's a gas tappet system, and this makes it sound more like a short recoil system, but the barrel would actually reciprocate rearward with the bolt a short degree, and then the bolt would cycle back into a special housing, and then it would recycle back further until the extent of rearward travel inside of that housing. So it had this weird locked in place for a short bit, free traveling for a short bit, then locked in place with this housing. And the only thing I can really think of as far as why they did this this kind of thing is that they thought that it would help reduce recoil by, the initial bit is definitely so that there would be a chance for the gases to escape down the barrel and pressure to be brought down, because there was a pretty high pressure in shooting these flechettes. So that makes sense. But when they go from free cycling to the bolt being captured by this housing and cycling back with that, I think that they just thought that maybe the increase in mass reciprocating back would then slow the bolt down dramatically, and that would help to soften the recoil. As far as I can tell from what I've read, reports indicate that didn't really function that well. It didn't act to really reduce recoil. Not to say that any of these rifles should have been super heavy recoiling to begin with. Again, that's one of the benefits of shooting a high velocity, very low weight projectile, is that you're able to shoot it with very little recoil and at a high rate of speed. Now, one of the things I thought was most interesting about Winchester's submission was their grenade launcher. So their grenade launcher mounted under the barrel, and it had a blow forward design. So to give you an idea of, if you're not familiar with blow forward designs, when the round is fired, it actually, through friction, pulls the barrel and moves it forward, which is part of the cycling. So when you loaded the rounds of the grenade rounds into this, there was actually 3 places you could load. There was kind of one feeding ramp right in the back. You would put your first load, and then in the sides, each side would also hold another round of the grenades. So you had to put one in each of these areas. When the first round fired, it would pull the barrel forward, and that would open an ejection port on the bottom of the grenade launcher, allowing just the casing to fall. And then it would return back to normal under spring pressure. Now, as it moves, barrel moves forward, it hits a switch, triggering one of the 2 side compartments to feed a grenade into the chamber. And the full length of the grenade cartridge was too big to fall through the ejection port. It had to be a fired case in order to be short enough to fall down. So it would sit there, and then when the barrel was coming back under spring tension, it would actually close around that, that round of grenade sitting there to chamber it effectively. So it's very mechanically interesting in how it works. It's less that the round is being chambered into a barrel as opposed to the barrel coming back around the grenade that's sitting there. Again, this was not considered to be a success, and Winchester didn't continue in the project, but we're going to go to the government submission for the SPIW program next, which is Springfield. So Springfield feels like they're actually almost cheating with their submission because it's so different that it's almost multiple different submissions. Their first design was trying to capture a kind of modular firearm design that could be converted from a standard configuration to a bullpup configuration with the same kind of receiver action and barrel. And you would just move it from either standard configuration to a bullpup configuration or back. Eventually, they had to kind of scrap the ability to convert it, and their first tests were just in the bullpup configuration. The magazine is probably one of the most interesting parts of Springfield's design in the first test. They used a 2-stack magazine, but I don't mean double stack. It was 2-stack. It had a stack of flechettes in front and then another stack behind it. And what happened would be when you would feed from the front stack of the magazine, it would actually, the follower would get to the top and kind of deactivate a cutoff switch, and then it would allow the second stack in the rear of the magazine to feed, which is really cool. What I find is super interesting is that when it went to the second trials, they actually converted back to a traditional platform of layout. And so they had a normal looking rifle as opposed to a bullpup. They also changed the magazine design when they went to the standard configuration rifle. And instead of having this front and back stack of 30 each, they went to a quad stack magazine holding 50 rounds. So, the government submission from the government armory is cheating by not following the government's own rules. But again, this is Springfield Armory, and again, there was an element to the grenade launcher in the second part of the second test, where they borrowed elements from the blow forward grenade launcher that Winchester had designed. But, again, this also didn't really lead anywhere. But the kind of, champion in my mind of this, not to say that anyone won, because obviously we continue to utilize the M16 rifle even past this test, was AAI. Our next participant and our final one to cover is AAI, who had been a huge proponent of this flechette idea for ammunition ever since they were, a driving force in Project Salvo. So AAI, again, they were able to submit both in the first set of tests and the second set of tests, and they were the only people besides Springfield to do so. their rifle was interesting in that they had to actually design a slightly different version of the ammunition for their rifle. So all of the 3 previous contestants had used the same type of ammunition where, there was a case loaded with a single flechette. AAI's project, however, their design was primer activated. So primer activation means that the primer of each round is actually designed to protrude from the case after firing. So you can see that most primers are completely flush or even a little recessed in a case of ammunition when it is properly loaded. So imagine if when this got fired, the primer was designed to push back under pressure from it firing. This would mean that this actually acts as its own piston. So the bolt carrier for AAI's design was this very super lightweight design, and it had a pretty thick firing pin because when it came forward and struck the primer would then push back against the firing pin and act kind of like a gas tappet or short gas piston, where it would tap the front of the bolt carrier, and that inertia would send the bolt carrier all the way back to cycle the rifle. The rifle as a whole was extremely light. It was about 6.3 pounds, and it was mostly a polymer chassis with stamped metal components. It came with a plastic or polymer 60 round drum, and again, this thing was a very light rifle, but in order to meet those requirements of the trials, it had to have a very complex kind of muzzle device that had 5 different bayonet lugs on it, 2 for the removable grenade launcher, as well as 1 for the bipod and 1 for a bayonet. It was just a mess of different lugs on the front of this rifle. AAI is also one of the only companies that kind of try to continue to develop their rifle after the trials, and indeed they kept going in 1966, and they made a new one in 1967 that kind of could get away from some of those restrictions. They could shave off weights from the end of the rifle because they didn't have to have those lugs there for the military requirements. In neither case did this, become a commercially successful rifle, but it is interesting that they really seem to have believed in that flechette idea, so that they would carry on development even after the trials were over. They're also probably one of the ones that seem like they did the most with it. They got the closest to having a successful rifle. And I think that it definitely looks really cool. I mean, it looks like a rifle you could pick up and just use in your day-to-day life. But yeah, the AAI rifle, again, just not something that saw very much success. Part of that is just due to limitations of the ammunition. Flechette ammunition has a big problem that it has to be extremely consistent in order to function properly. We're already dealing with the fact that we know it's going to be less accurate than a regular rifle round. We're operating under the assumption that that's fine because, again, moving from a 1 MOA to a 5 MOA is not going to have a problem with decreasing our chances of hitting the opponent at the distances that we're interested in. But if the flechette is traveling out of the barrel and those sabots don't correctly separate and fly off, then we're going to run into the problem that it could drag you off of aim. If the sabot blows off the end of the round inside of the barrel, then you're going to have a problem with accuracy. And if the sabot components fly off at too great a speed, then they could hit allies or ricochet and hit the shooter himself. So there's a lot of limitations in just the ammunition that are inherent to kind of what they were studying that limit the success of these type of rifles. Now, it certainly wouldn't be the last time we saw flechette ammunition being tested. After the SPIW program, there were other programs like the Future Weapon System program and, again, the ACR program in the 90s that we have already previously talked about on video. And some of these designs just get relooked at. So one of the great things about history is sometimes a concept that does not work at one point, with the continuing development of other technologies, our better material sciences, or simply our better ability to design things through computers and rapidly prototype with 3D printers and things, we can find ways now to make those same concepts that didn't work then a reality today. So I doubt it's the last time that we're really going to see flechettes come out as a possible way to improve firearm design, there are a lot of benefits. You know, if you can shoot something that's very lightweight, has negligible recoil, and you can shoot it very quickly at a higher, cycler rate, then it makes sense that that would be desirable for a rifle, especially if, we're operating under certain assumptions of, limited range and things. But certainly it did not work in the case of the SPIW program. Unfortunately, the result of it was basically we learned a lot of things and nothing really changed. We just kept going with the M16 family of rifles. But, again, that's one of the reasons why it becomes an interesting fact of history and possibly a little bit lesser known, is because it didn't succeed. Sometimes we learn more studying our failures, right, guys? Again, I hope you really enjoyed kind of this history lesson and looking at the weird and wacky guns that have been developed for possible consideration, but ultimately didn't go anywhere. If you'd like to see some more content like this, please give us ideas down below. Again, folks, we definitely appreciate your time. God bless, and we'll see you next time at Classic Firearms.